Hello, welcome to AI Late Night Stories. We have some very horrifying stories up ahead for you. Let's play a little game with these stories, shall we? Tonight I will tell you 3 stories. 2 of them will be true and 1 of them will be written by AI. See if you can guess which story is written by AI. Where there is no imagination, there is no horror. Enjoy.
In the heart of a dense, forgotten forest lay the remnants of the once thriving amusement park known as Luna Park. Built in the 1950s, it was a place of joy and laughter, filled with colorful attractions and bright lights that could be seen from miles away. But now, decades later, the park was a decaying ruin, its joy replaced by an eerie silence that hung thick in the air like a poisonous fog. Luna Park had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. The reasons were as varied as they were ominous. Some whispered of financial ruin, while others spoke of mysterious accidents that had claimed the lives of several visitors. But the truth, as it often is, was far darker than anyone could imagine. It was a cold autumn evening when a group of 5 friends, Mark, Lisa, Chris, Emily, and Sarah, decided to explore the old park. They were urban explorers, thrill seekers who delighted in discovering the forgotten corners of the world. They had heard rumors about Luna Park, about how it was haunted, how people who ventured inside never came out the same. But they brushed off the stories as nothing more than local legends, eager to see the place for themselves. They arrived at the park just as the sun began to set, casting long, twisted shadows across the cracked pavement. The entrance, once a grand archway adorned with lights and banners, was now a rusted skeleton. The gates creaked ominously as they pushed them open, revealing the dark, desolate world inside. The park was a graveyard of shattered dreams. The roller coasters, once the pride of Luna Park, were nothing but rusted steel frames, their tracks twisted and broken. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance like a giant skeletal eye, its carriages swaying gently in the wind. The carousel stood eerily still, its painted horses faded and chipped, their eyes wide and lifeless. As they ventured deeper into the park, the group couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else. Something metallic and pungent. They joked to keep the mood light, but their laughter was forced, their smiles strained. Even the bravest among them, Mark, felt a chill crawl up his spine. They reached the funhouse, its entrance a grotesque clown face with wide, grinning lips and hollow eyes. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing the cracked wood beneath, but the smile was still there, mocking them. Lisa hesitated at the entrance, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the others urged her on. They had come this far, they couldn't turn back now. Inside, the funhouse was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and distorted mirrors. The walls were lined with rotting wood, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The mirrors, once a source of delight for children, now reflected twisted, grotesque versions of themselves, their faces elongated, their eyes dark and hollow. As they navigated the maze, they began to hear things, whispers, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with each step. They called out to one another, their voices echoing eerily in the empty space, but the whispers continued, weaving through the air like a dark, invisible thread. The laughter of children, high-pitched and unnatural, floated through the corridors, sending shivers down their spines. Chris was the first to see it, a figure, small and hunched, darting across the hallway ahead of them. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, but when he blinked, it was gone. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just a trick of the light, but the doubt lingered in the back of his mind. They reached a large room at the center of the funhouse, its walls covered in faded murals of clowns and circus animals. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, torn fabric, and something else that glistened in the dim light. Emily knelt down to inspect it, her fingers brushing against the sticky substance. "Blood," she whispered, her voice trembling. The realization hit them like a cold wave. This was no ordinary abandoned park. Something terrible had happened here, something that had left its mark on the very walls. Panic set in, and they decided to leave, but as they turned to go back, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the walls themselves were speaking to them. The laughter of children echoed around them, and the air grew thick with the scent of blood and decay. The lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. And then they saw them, the figures in the mirrors. They were not reflections, but something else, something alive. The figures were children, or at least they had been once. Their skin was pale and translucent, their eyes black voids, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. They reached out from the mirrors, their hands pressing against the glass, leaving bloody smears. Mark tried to break the mirror with a piece of debris, but it was no use. The glass seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like water. The children began to emerge from the mirrors, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they crawled out into the room. Their movements were jerky and disjointed, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. The friends screamed and ran in all directions, desperate to escape. But the funhouse was no longer a maze of corridors. It had become a living nightmare, its walls shifting and closing in around them. Chris was the first to be caught. His scream cut short as the children swarmed him, their hands tearing into his flesh with unnatural strength. The others could only watch in horror as their friend was devoured before their eyes. The children turned their gaze on the remaining 4, their smiles widening as they advanced. One by one, they were picked off. Lisa dragged into a dark corner, her screams echoing through the halls. Emily swallowed by the walls themselves, her body crushed into nothingness. Mark and Sarah were the last ones left. They found themselves back at the entrance, the grotesque clown face leering down at them, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The whispers were deafening now, the laughter a cacophony of madness. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Mark turned to face the children, brandishing a broken piece of wood like a weapon, but it was no use. They swarmed him, their small hands tearing him apart as Sarah watched in terror. She backed against the wall, her mind breaking under the weight of the horror. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the grinning face of the clown, its eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. When the authorities found the park the next morning, they discovered nothing but bloodstains and fragments of torn clothing. The bodies were never recovered. Luna Park remains abandoned to this day, a place of nightmares, where the laughter of children still echoes in the wind, and the whispers of the forgotten linger in the shadows.
Story number 2.
The entrance to Sunset Park was swallowed by the encroaching forest. What was once a bustling amusement park, filled with the sounds of laughter and music, had been abandoned for over 40 years. Time had transformed it into a haunting relic of the past, where the remnants of childhood joy were now overshadowed by a pervasive sense of dread. It was mid-October when 6 college students, Alex, Jenny, Tom, Natalie, Greg, and Liz, decided to explore the park. They were a group bound by a shared love of urban exploration and a penchant for seeking thrills in forgotten places. Sunset Park had always been a local legend, a place where the bravest dared to tread. Stories of its closure were mixed with rumors of accidents, mysterious disappearances, and ghostly sightings. But to these thrill seekers, it was the perfect location for a Halloween adventure. As they made their way through the dense underbrush, the towering Ferris wheel came into view, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the pale evening sky. The once bright colors of the park had faded to murky shades of brown and gray. The entrance gate, which had once welcomed thousands of visitors, now stood rusted and ajar, as if inviting them to enter. "This is going to be epic," Tom said, grinning as he pushed the gate open with a loud creak. The others followed, their flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. They stepped onto the cracked pavement, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood, and an unnatural chill hung in the air. As they ventured deeper into the park, they came across the carousel. Its wooden horses were weathered and cracked, their glass eyes staring lifelessly into the void. Jenny shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Let's check out the funhouse," Greg suggested, pointing to the dilapidated building a short distance away. The faded sign above the entrance read House of Mirrors, its letters barely legible through the layers of grime. The group approached the funhouse, its entrance a gaping maw of darkness. The door hung off its hinges, and the interior was pitch black, save for the occasional flash of their lights. Stepping inside, they were greeted by a corridor lined with cracked mirrors, each reflecting distorted versions of themselves. "Creepy as hell," Liz muttered, her voice echoing in the narrow space. As they moved further in, the mirrors became increasingly warped, their reflections more grotesque. Tom, always the jokester, made faces at the mirrors, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The reflections seemed to linger a moment too long after they moved, the figures in the glass almost watching them. "Let's get out of here," Natalie said uneasily, glancing over her shoulder. But as they turned to leave, they found that the entrance had vanished. The corridor behind them was now a solid wall of mirrors, reflecting their growing panic. "Okay, this isn't funny," Alex said, his voice shaking. "Who's messing with us?" No one answered. The group stood in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The air grew colder, and the mirrors seemed to pulse with a dim, sickly light. Suddenly, Jenny screamed. Her reflection in the mirror closest to her began to move independently, grinning wickedly as it pressed its hands against the glass. The others watched in horror as the reflection slowly distorted, its features twisting and elongating until it became an unrecognizable, nightmarish figure. "What the hell is that?" Greg shouted, stumbling back. The distorted reflection reached out, its hands breaking through the glass with a deafening shatter. Shards flew in all directions as the creature crawled out of the mirror, its body a grotesque amalgamation of twisted limbs and shadow. It moved with a sickening, jerky motion, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. The group scattered, their screams filling the funhouse as more creatures emerged from the mirrors, each one more horrifying than the last. Liz was the first to fall, her legs giving out as one of the monsters lunged at her, its elongated fingers wrapping around her throat. She thrashed and clawed at the creature, but it was no use. It lifted her off the ground with unnatural strength, her screams choking off as it snapped her neck with a sickening crunch. The others ran deeper into the funhouse, desperate to escape, but the corridors seemed to twist and shift around them, leading them in circles. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, as if the building were alive, feeding off their fear. Tom was next. He turned a corner, only to come face to face with his own reflection, grinning maniacally. Before he could react, the reflection reached out, its hand plunging into his chest. He gasped in pain as he felt the cold fingers wrap around his heart. The last thing he saw was his own twisted smile as the life drained from his eyes. The remaining four found themselves in a large chamber at the center of the funhouse. The walls were lined with broken mirrors, each reflecting the terror etched on their faces. At the far end of the room stood a tall, thin figure draped in tattered rags. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. "Welcome to my carnival," the figure rasped, its voice echoing off the walls. "Who are you?" Alex demanded, though his voice trembled with fear. The figure chuckled, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "I am the ringmaster of this dark carnival. You have entered my domain, and now you will entertain me." The mirrors in the room suddenly came to life, their surfaces rippling like water. From each mirror, another creature emerged, their forms shifting and changing as they approached the terrified group. "We need to get out of here," Greg shouted, grabbing Natalie's hand. But there was no escape. The creatures closed in, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Jenny backed into a corner, her mind reeling with terror. One of the creatures lunged at her, its mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. With a single bite, it tore into her flesh, her blood splattering across the mirror behind her. Alex and Greg tried to fight back, but it was futile. The creatures overwhelmed them, their twisted bodies moving with unnatural speed. Alex screamed as one of the monsters bit into his shoulder, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh. He struggled, but the creature only bit down harder, ripping away chunks of meat as it devoured him alive. Natalie and Greg were the last to fall, their bodies torn apart by the ravenous creatures. The ringmaster watched with satisfaction as the blood soaked into the floor, his laughter echoing through the chamber. When the creatures had finished their grisly feast, they slunk back into the mirrors, their forms disappearing into the glass as if they had never existed. The ringmaster stepped forward, his hood falling back to reveal a skull-like face devoid of flesh. "Thank you for the entertainment," he whispered, his voice a hollow rasp. With a wave of his hand, the funhouse returned to its former state. The broken mirrors repaired themselves, the twisted corridors straightened, and the entrance reappeared, its door hanging open as if inviting new victims. The bodies of the 6 friends were nowhere to be found. The only trace of their presence was the blood-stained floor and the faint echoes of their screams, lingering in the air like a dark memory. As the night wore on, the forest surrounding Sunset Park grew still, the wind carrying away the last remnants of life from the abandoned amusement park. But deep within the funhouse, the ringmaster waited, his eyes gleaming with anticipation for the next group of thrill-seekers who would dare to enter his dark carnival.
Story number 3.
It was me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and her brother Mike who decided to go. We were restless, looking for something to do, and someone, I don't even remember who, suggested we check out the old park. It sounded like a good idea at the time. A spooky old amusement park, a few beers, some laughs. What could go wrong? The entrance was easy to get through. The gates were still there, but the chain was long gone, probably rusted away years ago. We squeezed through the gap and stepped onto the overgrown path. The place was a mess. Weeds and vines had taken over, choking the life out of everything. The rides were just shadows of what they used to be. Twisted metal, broken seats, paint peeling off in long strips. It was hard to believe that this place had once been full of kids' laughter and carnival music. Creepy as hell, Jake muttered, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "You scared?" Sarah teased, though I could hear the edge in her voice too. She wasn't any more comfortable than the rest of us. "Just cautious," Jake replied, but I could tell he was trying to keep up the bravado. We all were. We wandered around for a while, checking out the rides. The Ferris wheel loomed over us like some kind of giant, its cars dangling lifelessly. Carousel was eerie, the horses frozen in mid-gallop, their glass eyes staring blankly into the void. It was like walking through a graveyard where all the tombstones were carnival rides. After a while, we found ourselves standing in front of the roller coaster. The old wooden behemoth was still standing, but just barely. The tracks were warped, the wood splintered and gray. The cars sat on the tracks, covered in dirt and grime, as if they were just waiting for someone to take one last ride. "Let's check it out," Mike said, his voice tinged with excitement. He was always the one to push things too far, always the one who didn't know when to stop. "You're crazy if you think I'm getting on that thing," Sarah shot back. "Come on, it'll be fun." Mike was already climbing into one of the cars, brushing off the dust. "It's not like it still works." I wasn't so sure. The whole place gave me the creeps, and the roller coaster was the worst of it. There was something about it that just felt wrong. But before I could say anything, Jake was climbing in next to Mike, laughing like it was the best idea ever. "Are you guys serious?" I asked, but they just grinned at me. "Don't be a wuss," Jake said, patting the seat next to him. "Just a quick ride, and then we'll get out of here." Reluctantly, I climbed in. Sarah hesitated for a moment longer, but she didn't want to be left out, so she slid in next to me. The four of us sat there, crammed into the front car, feeling like idiots for even considering this. The car was rusty, the seat uncomfortable, and I could smell the damp, musty odor of decaying wood. "All right, let's do this," Mike said, giving a mock cheer. He reached up and grabbed the lever that had once released the brake. I was about to tell him not to, but before I could get the words out, he yanked it down. At first, nothing happened. We all laughed nervously, the tension breaking for a moment. But then, with a loud creak, the car jerked forward. The laughter died in our throats as the car began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it rolled down the tracks. "What the hell?" Jake started, but the car was already rattling along the old wooden tracks, the noise deafening in the silence of the night. It didn't make any sense. The park had been abandoned for years. There was no power. No way this thing should be working, but it was. The car raced along the tracks, climbing the first hill with agonizing slowness. I could feel the wood creaking beneath us, the entire structure groaning like it might collapse at any moment. "Get us off this thing!" Sarah screamed, clutching my arm. Her nails dug into my skin, but I barely noticed. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with panic. We crested the top of the hill, and for a brief moment everything was still. The entire park lay spread out below us, a twisted maze of metal and wood, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Then the car plunged downward, and all hell broke loose. The ride was a nightmare. The car hurtled along the tracks at breakneck speed, rattling and shaking so violently that I thought we'd be thrown off at any moment. The wind whipped past my face, stinging my eyes. I could barely breathe, the force of the descent pressing me into the seat. And then the screaming started. At first, I thought it was Sarah, or maybe one of the guys, but then I realized the screams weren't coming from us. They were coming from behind us, from somewhere deep within the twisted structure of the roller coaster. They were high-pitched, shrill, filled with terror and agony. It was the sound of someone being torn apart. "What is that?" Jake yelled, but his voice was lost in the wind and the screams. The car sped into a dark tunnel, and the screams grew louder, echoing off the walls. I could see flashes of something in the darkness. Faces, twisted in pain, reaching out to us with skeletal hands. Blood dripped from the walls, pooling on the tracks, splattering against the car as we raced through. "This isn't real," I repeated to myself, but it felt all too real. We burst out of the tunnel, and the car careened around a sharp corner. I felt the wood splintering beneath us, heard the sickening crunch as the tracks gave way. The car tilted dangerously to one side, and I was sure we were going to crash. But somehow, impossibly, it stayed on the tracks, and then we saw it. Up ahead at the end of the ride stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body draped in tattered rags. Its face, or what was left of it, was a grotesque mask of rotting flesh and exposed bone. Empty eye sockets stared at us. As the car hurtled toward it, its mouth opened. A gaping maw filled with darkness, and it let out a scream that pierced through me, freezing my blood. The car slammed into the figure, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, the twisted wreckage of the roller coaster all around me. The others were there too, groaning in pain, but alive. We were covered in cuts and bruises, but somehow we had survived. We never talked about what we saw that night, about the screams or the figure that waited for us at the end of the ride. We never went back to Laughing Pines, and as far as I know, no one else has either. The park is still there, rotting away in the woods, waiting for the next group of fools to come along, but I can still hear the screams in my dreams, and I know deep down that the park is still alive, still hungry, and I know that one day it'll come for me again.